I want to start actually with a bit of a lightning round. Since we just heard about the politics, I want to ask about the economic landscape, and let's at least are you optimistic, pessimistic, or neutral about the next, say, 12 to 18 months? Let's talk about the US economy first. Abby, I'll start with you.
Relative to what I had expected before, I am more pessimistic than I was.
More pessimistic. Gary?
Well, I might as well balance this out. I'm optimistic.
Optimistic.
Extremely optimistic.
Extremely optimistic. Okay, so let's...
I'll go the extreme category.
The extreme category. Okay, so then let's just do another, before we drill down a bit, let's talk about what are you most concerned about? Abby, I'll start with you, since you're mildly pessimistic.
What I'm concerned about are changes in policy that are not beneficial. You know, the starting point for the US economy right now and for the new administration is actually quite good. The US economy is growing, not as rapidly as it was in the immediate post-pandemic period, but it's growing quickly enough for job creation and also for excellent profit growth. So that is an excellent starting point. So when I take a look at what could go wrong, I think about a few things. And I don't want to be a Pollyanna about this. I recognize there are problems in the economy. There are categories of workers. There are geographies in our country that have not benefited as much as others over the last few years. And those problems need to be addressed. What I worry about is some of the proposals that have been made during the campaign. Now, as Gary would be very quick to point out, there's a huge difference between campaign proposals and governing. But here are the things on my checklist of things to be concerned about. Number one, tariffs. There are sometimes appropriate places to use tariffs.
We'll talk about tariffs. Don't worry about that.
Okay.
Yeah. We're going to cover the landscape here.
Okay, here's the landscape. I'm concerned about inappropriate application of tariff. Okay. I'm concerned about excessive fiscal stimulus, particularly stimulus that stimulates demand but not supply. I am also concerned about changes in the regulatory environment. And that perhaps is a little bit surprising, I think, to some people here, because we all know that regulation can always be improved. But there are some concerns that I have about the manner in which regulation might be changing.
And we're going to do some deeper dives on that. And I think the word regulation might actually be one of the sources of optimism for our other panelists here. Gary, let's ask about what are you most excited about or concerned, but since you're extremely optimistic, let's go with the good stuff.
So let me start where Abby was headed for a second here. So look, the economic data on the surface right now is pretty good. I think beneath the surface, there's probably more trouble than people want to admit. The current administration has financed our deficit in very short duration. So we've got this duration wall issue. We have this issue where the immigrants into this country have cost cities enormous amount of money. Amazingly, those cities, mostly democratic cities, have managed to keep themselves very quiet up till today on the cost of that. We're going to have to pay for this. I think you're going to see cities running to Washington looking for an enormous amount of handout. And I think there's going to need to be some money spent. And we've got a housing cost issue going on. So we start with that premise. But then we roll forward into where I think Lynn and I get pretty optimistic. And we start looking.
I like how you're all speaking for each other.
Well, we both were, well, she gave me the option to be very optimistic. So I'm going to exercise my option. We roll forward into an environment where, you know, the business environment and business investment is in a position where it is going to stimulate economic growth. You know, I think the CEO community, which is represented well here, has been sitting on their hands for the better part of 2 years, not knowing what to do, not understanding what the future environment would look like. I think the amount of CapEx that's going to come into this country and the amount of investments that's going to be made, and look, some of it is going to be pressure to invest in manufacturing in this country. What the Trump administration is doing, and I hear this from CEOs every day right now, is, okay, I want to get in front of this. I want to move manufacturing back to the United States. Now, look, I know the federal government wants to help me. I need help with the state and local government to get permitting to be able to build manufacturing back in the United States. And I'm going to need help with hiring employees because we do have an employment problem in this country. So, but I do think we're going to ultimately figure these things out. And we're going to see more investment, we're going to see more economic growth, and we're going to see a smart regulatory environment. I don't think we're going to see a hands-off regulatory environment. As the last panel said, go back and look at the 4 years of the Trump administration. I don't think anyone would call that a cavalier regulatory environment. I think you would call it a relatively smart.
So that's,
yeah, I think you would call it a relatively smart, business-friendly regulatory environment.
Before I move on to Lynn, just one quick question, since nobody has tweeted that you're not going to be part of the next administration. If you were chosen, would you want to serve? I know, I mean, you can talk about the likelihood, but would you?
You know, I have the best new job in America. I just became a grandfather. I'm really enjoying that one. So, but look, public service is public service. When you're asked to serve, you have to consider it.
Okay. Lynn, you're extremely optimistic. Why?
Yeah. I think the U.S. economy has weathered a pretty large storm underneath the surface over the last 2.5 years, and the U.S. economy has shown the strength, not just in one sector, but in all sectors. You see the returns from companies in all sectors, energy, utilities, industrials, consumers even come back. In addition to technology, that is really driving the market at the moment. So I just don't see a stress point that would cause me to be pessimistic about the economy. Additionally, there's been a lot of uncertainty both on private companies when they're going to come to market. They were waiting for Fed to cut interest rates, the election to happen, especially if it was a decisive election. Either way, because underneath, if it was not decided, it would have caused volatility in the market. So we've got quite a large backlog of companies that are waiting to go out and become public companies. And the ones who have gone this year have actually done pretty well.
Stocks overall have done very well, obviously.
Absolutely. If I look at just some data, you know, in a normal election year, the S&P returns 12.5% growth. This year, we're 22, 23% already, prior to even what happened last Wednesday. So I think the last few years, we've gotten a handle on inflation. I think we've gotten a handle on a variety of other systemic issues. And if I look at how the US has recovered relative to other countries in particular from COVID, it has shown the strength and resilience of our economy in a way that no other country has been able to demonstrate.
Well, before we drill down on sort of what's happening in this country, I'd be remiss not to ask about the rest of the world. And let's do that again with the optimism, pessimism. How do you think? Well, obviously, China, Europe, very different parts of the world. But in general, how do you think we're going to see the global economic landscape?
Sure. First, let me clarify. Your question was not, are you optimistic or pessimistic? But relative to where you were, what's the incremental change?
Yes.
So I want everybody to get that sense
yes,
from me.
Yes, Professor, mea culpa. You're absolutely right. Too true, very true.
And so I'm going to go back to a point I made before, which is the U.S. economy is actually doing quite well. We are at a growth rate that is generating jobs and generating corporate profits. And when we compare ourselves to the rest of the world, there really are very few other
voters
countries.
did not think so. I will point that out.
Voters did not think so. There's all kinds of discrepancies in what voters think and what we see in various surveys. So for example, the surveys that get done that ask individuals, how is your household doing economically? Almost everybody says, pretty good. And why not? Unemployment rate is about 4%. There have been significant gains in disposable personal income. Wages have been rising in excess of inflation. People feel good about their own situation. But the next question in these surveys is, well, what about the rest of the country? Oh, that's terrible.
That's fair enough. Let me go pivot to the rest of the world. What would you want to say about kind of, we've talked about tariffs right now. We're talking about obviously what's happening with the U.S. economy. How optimistic relative to where we are now would you be for the next 12 to 18
So think about the United States as being in a good position, not perfect, but good and resilient. If you take a look at some of the other major economies, the picture is actually kind of cloudy. China, for example, has not been doing well. Post-pandemic, they have been suffering from their really bad policies, public health policies during the pandemic. They've not applied the right sort of public stimulus. The package they announced just last week is now viewed as a disaster, is one way to put it. But we also
We have people in the audience, I hope, that will also speak to that.
Okay, and then of course there's Europe. You know, if you take a look at where global GDP is generated from, you know, the United States and China, but Europe is pretty large with regard to real GDP. They would be among the top two in the world, and there are many European countries that are on the cusp of recession. Just last week, you know, it wasn't just the Fed that lowered interest rates, it was the Bank of England. You have problems in Scandinavia, you have problems in Germany as well.
So you're net pessimistic, you think?
Well, I'm concerned about that, particularly if there is an imposition across the board of tariffs, because if you look at who do we trade with, we trade a great deal with Europe. If, in fact, you put on that 10% blanket tariff, and I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, we'll all wait and see, but if you put that 10% blanket tariff on Europe, we're talking about dinging GDP in Europe by between 0.3 and 0.5% GDP.
Yeah.
And if an economy is only growing at 1 or 1.5, that's problematic. The other thing to keep in mind is that if there's a blanket tariff of 10%, who are the most important trade partners for the United States? This is a rhetoric question, class. It's North America,
Canada.
right? It's
the
Mexico.
Canadian me.
It's
Well,
no, let me finish, Diane.
Okay.
It's Mexico and Canada, and there's all this weird double counting because a car that is produced, say, in the United States, the parts can go back and forth over those different borders up to 15 to 20 times. So when we put a tariff on Mexico and Canada, we're putting the tariff on ourselves as well. And as so many people have said, these other countries are not paying the tariff. Ultimately, it's the US consumer that is. And so these tariffs are bad for inflation, and they're probably bad for GDP.
I don't think there are many
well.
pro-tariff people in this maybe. Gary, what do you think?
There's a point.
me
Wait, one more point, if I may.
And then I'm going to go to Gary.
There are some appropriate tariffs. If another country is dumping stuff.
Of course. I think
if-
we'd agree that if it's made in the U.S. and they're doing it at the cost of, you know, unfair labor, et cetera.
And China has been dumping stuff. They've been producing in certain products more than total global demand.
This is lots of fodder for debate. Gary,
stopping.
let me go. No need to stop. I want to go to Gary. Tell me, we're talking about the global economy now, and of course, you're somebody who's been known as a pro-free trade advocate. Good luck with that, and what do you think?
No, I don't think it's good luck with that. Let's wait and see.
Okay.
So first of all, I mean, if you listen to what the Trump administration says, they want open, free trade. So their view is if you put tariffs on us, we will put tariffs on you. If you are willing to drop your tariffs on us, we will drop our tariffs on you. So I do think there's going to be a bunch of renegotiation on tariffs and trade barriers and the way that we realign. But I also think it's interesting because I've heard from a bunch of CEOs recently that are willing and going to move manufacturing to the United States. So there's a lot of good that is going to come out of this. You know, we always want to talk about the bad side of every part of these equations. We have to look at the other side of the good parts of these equations. And so when I look at the world as a whole, I'm not as pessimistic as Abby, that's for sure. I think there's some good spots of the world. There's some bad spots. I think China is a tough spot, and I think China and the United States, I don't know if we can come to a real relationship or not. It will be interesting to watch, but I do think they're in a tough starting spot. So when you start in a tough spot, you have a tough place to go. But when I look at what's going on in the Middle East, I'm pretty optimistic about our relationship with the Middle East and what's going on in the Middle East. Europe, I think we could potentially end up in a better spot, but it's not completely obvious to me. But I think we all know if the US economy thrives, being the biggest economy in the world by a factor of multiples of any of the individual European economies, it helps the rest of the world.
Can I, before I move on to Lynn, since you're one of the architects of tax policy in the last Trump administration, and now it looks like we will have a continuation of the consumer tax cuts into 2025 and beyond. I don't know what that does to the debt, but certainly there's been discussion about devaluing the US dollar. I mean, give me some sense relative to the rest of the world what that does to the US economy, just the tax picture.
Well, the tax picture, people like predictability, they like stability. I think if you look back on the last period of the new tax scenario that we've lived in, and I'll take it aside here and remind everyone that only the personal side of the tax code expires the end of 2025. The corporate piece is not expiring. That said, we all know that when Congress starts dealing with the tax code and they open the book, they'll look at every page. So I'm not here telling you they're only going to look at the personal side. I think what we've learned is that when we have a accommodative tax code, our economy tends to thrive. So if you go back and look at the CBO scoring back when we did tax policy, the scoring was completely wrong because they use a very static scoring. They basically say, even though you cut taxes and even though you do the following things, we don't think the economy is going to change trajectory. We don't think employment's going to look like it is. We don't think all those repatriated dollars that you're forcing repatriated from US companies back in the United States is going to stimulate economic growth. Well, guess what? It was wrong. In fact, I think one of the biggest mistakes that economists made over the last 5 years was they were all predicting that we would go into recession in the United States. I think one of the reasons we didn't go into recession is the massive amount of cash that was repatriated from foreign earnings that was deemed taxed in the United States in the new tax code. It was brought back by US companies and it was invested in the United States, keeping job growth, keeping manufacturing going. So I think I know we will see some tax code changes this year, but I think it's going to be very similar to what we have now with some tweaks. Look, I will be the first to admit, when we got the tax code done in 2017, it wasn't perfect. There's no law that's ever been signed that was perfect because at the end of the day, the legislative process in the United States is a set of compromises.
Yeah, and I want to go, Lynn, I want to ask you a little bit about what's happening. You mentioned it earlier, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. But we've seen a lot of companies that have gone to the private markets, private credit, private equity. Do you anticipate that, you mentioned more companies going public, so talk a little bit about the regulatory environment and what you anticipate there that would make a difference, both with the US, but also global listings too.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's going to be quite a few companies that are going to look to get out pretty early on in 25. We actually have some companies that are still flirting with 24, to be honest, now that the volatility has come off in the last week. So we'll see where that lands. I don't know where we're going to land on the regulatory side. I do think a lot of the...
Plus there's the AI regulation.
Yeah, I think a lot of the regulations that were passed under the current administration will be re-examined, particularly some of the ones that have been less popular with corporate CEOs and CFOs around things that look at share buybacks and how to use your balance sheet, and then some of the ESG disclosure. So some of those things probably will get looked at.
Okay.
And as you start to layer on some of these regulations that aren't just about what's your profit, what's your loss, and disclosing that in a transparent fashion, that then starts to bring down the cost of going public.
Let me turn to the audience here. We have questions over here. I see a question. Wait for the mic runner. Go to you next.
Hi, Alex Zhavankov in Silicon Medicine. It's almost 11 a.m. and I've heard the word AI only once.
From me. Shame on me. Okay.
And it looks like generative AI has played a huge role boosting the economy over the past few years. I mean, our company managed to get the cost of drug discovery to 1/10 and 1/3 of the time. But it looks like for the rest of the industry, it looks like we are in a dot-com bubble again. Do you see this trend in generative AI with economic productivity and economic growth being boosted continue, or are we going to see a bubble burst?
I believe that would be a question for the vice chairman of IBM. I'm going to go to you,
Well,
Gary.
it's also a question for the New York Stock Exchange.
And weigh in, everybody. I know our time is, we want to get into a few questions.
Right, okay, so I'll be relatively quick then. So look, I do not think we're in an AI bubble. I think we're in the very early beginning of AI. This is a long-term evolution. So if you poll CEOs, if you poll a community like this, everyone in this room is talking about AI. If you search how many times you talk about it in your earnings report and your data, you're all mentioning AI. If I ask each one of you what you're specifically using it for, it gets a little bit more clouded to what you're actually using it for. But everyone in this room knows it's going to play a role in the future of your company. We're seeing the evolution. We're seeing companies take it up. We're seeing companies use it for new and different applications. It's one of the most creative productivity tools we've ever seen. And as companies, as an economy, we are trying to create productivity. Productivity is the key to success for an economy, for your company. People are starting to understand the tools, whether it's a HR chatbot, where you can now run a much more effective human resources department with less people, whether it's a code assist product, where you're trying to port one set of computer language to another. We're now starting to see the real applications being implemented, but we're just at the beginning of this evolution, and companies are going to find more and more uses as these models get more and more robust and they get more used to dealing with each of these companies. Yeah. So I do not think it's a bubble, but I think it's a long-term evolution.
Yeah, and the regulatory environments. I'm going to go for it. We have one more question right here, and then...
Thank you. I'm Michael Garin. I actually, in 1972, started the Fortune conferences.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
72 to 75. We talk about the global economy and the economy in general, but we haven't had any conversation yet about the distribution of those rewards. And it seems to me that income inequality was a big driver, not only in the election here, but a lot of the discontent all over the world. Do you want to say something about income inequality and whether that is going to be addressed?
Yep. Abby?
Yeah, I'm happy to address what I think is an extraordinarily difficult, but perhaps the most important issue. And you're correct. This is a political problem, a political obstacle in many, many countries. And we began to see income inequality really begin to become more and more problematic with the financial crisis, and then the pandemic just put it on steroids. So how do we address this? I think that there were some elements of the Biden economic policies which were appropriate in trying to address this, because how do we bolster long-term productivity growth? As Gary said, that's what gives you economic growth. That's what gives you economic happiness for the population. AI is certainly a component, but when we take a look at the broader categories, it's investment in capital, it's also investment in labor. And we have many workers in the United States and elsewhere who are looking at AI or looking at other developments and say, I'm not part of that. How can I be part of it? So the Biden team did a few things.
And I want to ask you just to be quick, because we're going to have to sum up soon.
Okay, with bipartisan support, spending on infrastructure was critically important because it also brought broadband to rural areas. We see under the CHIPS and Science Act some important spending, not just on bringing semiconductor fabs back to the United States, but actually enhancing scientific research, which ultimately gives us the products and technology to bolster productivity.
So Abby, I want to be able to stop you there so I can ask. I actually want to ask very quickly, since I've not asked you yet, just a quick round robin before I go to final thoughts. On a scale of 1 to 10, how important is addressing debt? Just quickly, Lynn? Out of 1 to 10.
What is,
is
is 1 most important or 10?
one being least important, 10 being most important.
I'd say 9 or 10.
9 or 10. Gary?
I'm there, 9 or 10.
9 or 10?
In the next year or two,
yes.
I would put it down at sort of 6 or 7.
What about regulation?
In what context?
In context of important of addressing the current regulations that are, in your mind, choking business.
I would say it's probably like a 6 or 7.
6 or 7?
8 or 8.
8 or 9. What about addressing climate change, which has not been on the agenda for the parties? How important is it as a priority for the administration?
I think it's now just part of the way businesses think.
So
I think it's now just the way businesses
I could get into
operating.
demographic
Particularly
time bombs.
when you consider the AI revolution,
Yeah.
which I agree with Gary, we're still in the early innings on.
I feel like I should ask very quickly, Jerome Powell, should he step down?
In my view?
Yeah.
No, he should not. I started my career at the Federal Reserve. I worked with the chairman who did bow to political pressure, and it was an economic disaster.
Not very good. So let me give you each a chance to give some final thoughts for this audience. And again, I know this is teaser content, so thank you very much. And please follow up with our panelists here. Lynn, I'm going to start with you. Some final thoughts for how you're thinking about the trends shaping the global and U.S. landscape.
So aside from the fact that I think the economy is doing pretty well, I do think AI we're at the early stages of. And I think the reason you're not seeing specific use cases mentioned by CEOs is because they're thinking about the data governance piece.
Great. Gary?
Look, there's so many things I could talk about. I think AI is very important. AI regulation, we haven't talked about AI regulation. There's an interesting sort of discussion going on. Do you regulate the models, which I do not believe you should regulate the models, or you do regulate the use cases? I'm a big supporter of regulating the use cases. We want everyone to contribute to models. We want the models to get as big and robust as they can. But do you need to regulate something that's picking songs? Probably not. Do you need to regulate something that's diagnosing medical things? Probably should regulate that. So I think this is going to be a big evolving area in the next 4 years.
And final thoughts to you.
Policy is the people who implement it. And one of my very big concerns is something called Schedule F. Every administration deserves to have a cadre of political appointees. In the US federal government, there are about 10,000 of those people spread across the country in various agencies. What Schedule F would do, and this was actually a rule put in place under Trump 1.0, but rescinded by Mr. Biden, under Schedule F, those 10,000 would remain political appointees, but the 40,000 experts under them, those positions would also be switched over to political appointments. So instead of having scientists and lawyers and others who are familiar with specific areas actually implementing the laws put in place by the Congress, we would have another 40,000 political appointees, and that worries me.
Okay. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Again, they will be out around today, and I appreciate their thoughts.
Thank you.